I was entertained by the proprietary but yet ironical air with which he showed me the city. He thought in his heart that there was none in the United States to equal it, but he saw quite clearly that his attitude was comic. He drove me round to the various buildings and swelled with satisfaction when I expressed a proper admiration for their architecture. He showed me the houses of rich men. "That's the Stubbs house," he said. "It cost $100,000 to build. The Stubbs are one of our best families. Old man Stubbs came here as a missionary more than 70 years ago." He hesitated a little and looked at me with twinkling eyes through his big round spectacles. "All our best families are missionary families," he said. "You're not very much in Honolulu unless your father or your grandfather converted the heathen." "Is that so?" "Do you know your Bible?" "Fairly," I answered. "There is a text which says, 'The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge.' I guess it runs differently in Honolulu. The fathers brought Christianity to the Kanaka, and the children jumped his land." "Heaven helps those who help themselves," I murmured. "It surely does. By the time the natives of this island had embraced Christianity, they had nothing else they could afford to embrace. The kings gave the missionaries land as a mark of esteem, and the missionaries bought land by way of laying up treasure in heaven. It surely was a good investment. One missionary left the business, I think one may call it a business without offense, and became a land agent, but that is an exception. Mostly it was their sons who looked after the commercial side of the concern. Oh, it's a fine thing to have a father who came here 50 years ago to spread the faith." But he looked at his watch. "Gee, it's stopped. That means it's time to have a cocktail." We sped along an excellent road bordered with red hibiscus and came back into the town. "Have you been to the Union Saloon?" "Not yet." "We'll go there." I knew it was the most famous spot in Honolulu, and I entered it with a lively curiosity. You get to it by a narrow passage from King Street, and in the passage are offices, so that thirsty souls may be supposed bound for one of these just as well as for the saloon. It is a large square room, with 3 entrances, and opposite the bar, which runs the length of it, 2 corners have been partitioned off into little cubicles. Legend states that they were built so that King Kalakaua might drink there without being seen by his subjects, and it is pleasant to think that in one or other of these he may have sat over his bottle, a coal-black potentate with Robert Louis Stevenson. There is a portrait of him, in oils, in a rich gold frame. But there are also 2 prints of Queen Victoria. On the walls, besides, are old line engravings of the 18th century, one of which, and heaven knows how it got there, is after a theatrical picture by De Wilde, and there are oleographs from the Christmas supplements of the Graphic and the Illustrated London News of 20 years ago. Then there are advertisements of whiskey, gin, champagne, and beer, and photographs of baseball teams and of native orchestras. The place seemed to belong not to the modern, hustling world that I had left in the bright street outside, but to one that was dying. It had the savor of the day before yesterday. Dingy and dimly lit, it had a vaguely mysterious air, and you could imagine that it would be a fit scene for shady transactions. It suggested a more lurid time, when ruthless men carried their lives in their hands, and violent deeds diapered the monotony of life. When I went in, the saloon was fairly full. A group of businessmen stood together at the bar, discussing affairs, and in a corner 2 Kanakas were drinking. 2 or 3 men, who might have been storekeepers, were shaking dice. The rest of the company plainly followed the sea. They were captains of tramps, first mates, and engineers. Behind the bar, busily making the Honolulu cocktail for which the place was famous, served 2 large half-castes, in white, fat, clean-shaven, and dark-skinned, with thick curly hair and large bright eyes. Winter seemed to know more than half the company, and when we made our way to the bar, a little fat man in spectacles, who was standing by himself, offered him a drink. "No, you have one with me, Captain," said Winter. He turned to me. "I want you to know Captain Butler." The little man shook hands with me. We began to talk, but my attention distracted by my surroundings, I took small notice of him, and after we had each ordered a cocktail, we separated. When we had got into the motor again, and were driving away, Winter said to me, "I'm glad we ran up against Butler. I wanted you to meet him. What did you think of him?" "I don't know that I thought very much of him at all," I answered. "Do you believe in the supernatural?" "I don't exactly know that I do," I smiled. "A very queer thing happened to him a year or two ago. You ought to have him tell you about it." "What sort of thing?" Winter did not answer my question. "I have no explanation of it myself," he said, "but there's no doubt about the facts. Are you interested in things like that?" "Things like what?" "Spells and magic and all that." "I've never met anyone who wasn't." Winter paused for a moment. "I guess I won't tell you myself. You ought to hear it from his own lips, so that you can judge. How are you fixed up for tonight?" "I've got nothing on at all." "Well, I'll get hold of him between now and then, and see if we can't go down to his ship." Winter told me something about him. Captain Butler had spent all his life on the Pacific. He had been in much better circumstances than he was now, for he had been first officer and then captain of a passenger boat plying along the coast of California. But he had lost his ship, and a number of passengers had been drowned. "Drink, I guess," said Winter. Of course there had been an inquiry which had cost him his certificate, and then he drifted further afield. For some years he had knocked about the South Seas, but he was now in command of a small schooner which sailed between Honolulu and the various islands of the group. It belonged to a Chinese, to whom the fact that his skipper had no certificate meant only that he could be had for lower wages, and to have a white man in charge was always an advantage. And now that I had heard this about him, I took the trouble to remember more exactly what he was like. I recalled his round spectacles, and the round blue eyes behind them, and so gradually reconstructed him before in my mind. He was a little man, without angles, plump, with a round face, like the full moon, and a little fat round nose. He had fair short hair, and he was red-faced and clean-shaven. He had plump hands, dimpled on the knuckles, and short fat legs. He was a jolly soul, and the tragic experience he had gone through seemed to have left him unscarred. Though he must have been 34 or 35, he looked much younger. But after all I had given him but a superficial attention, and now that I knew of this catastrophe, which had obviously ruined his life, I promised myself that when I saw him again I would take more careful note of him. It is very curious to observe the differences of emotional response that you find in different people. Some can go through terrific battles, the fear of imminent death, and unimaginable horrors, and preserve their soul unscathed, while with others the trembling of the moon on a solitary sea, or the song of a bird in a thicket, will cause a convulsion great enough to transform their entire being. Is it due to strength or weakness, want of imagination or instability of character? I do not know. When I called up in my fancy that scene of shipwreck, with the shrieks of the drowning, and the terror, and then later the ordeal of the inquiry, the bitter grief of those who sorrowed for the lost, and the harsh things he must have read of himself in the papers, the shame and the disgrace, it came to me with a shock to remember that Captain Butler had talked with the frank obscenity of a schoolboy of the Hawaiian girls, and of Eulé, the red light district, and of his successful adventures. He laughed readily, and one would have thought he could never laugh again. I remembered his shining white teeth. They were his best feature. He began to interest me, and thinking of him and his gay insouciance, I forgot the particular story to hear which I was to see him again. I wanted to see him rather to find out, if I could a little more, what sort of man he was. Winter made the necessary arrangements, and after dinner we went down to the waterfront. The ship's boat was waiting for us, and we rowed out. The schooner was